Chapter 13. Rarely do we find men who willingly engage in hard, solid thinking. There is an almost universal quest for easy answers and half-baked solutions. Nothing pains some people more than having to think. Martin Luther King, Jr. Grace put up the dinner dishes, put up the towel, and made her way through the house to the back bedroom. Her mind was full of thoughts, turning things over, trying to sort things out. She felt that a change was needed, though she had no idea what it could be or which direction it would take. As she sat there in the dark, she knew that she was at her wit's end. Grace sat there, frustrated. "I've got to do something. I'm tired of pretending I'm strong and unshakable." There he was, swooping over her like a small black bat. Smug shrieked. Calling Joe's friends might help. Maybe they could straighten him out. Maybe he would listen to them. Maybe they could point out to him what a jerk he has become. She took her cell phone from her pocket and looked through her contacts to find Mason's number. It was the most logical choice since he and Joe were close friends. Mason lived in Hollywood and became famous for his worldly wisdom. Millions were made from his best-selling advice books and the articles that were published each month in Hollywood Review magazine. A dignified, silver-haired Tinseltown native, he was respected as a shrewd businessman and universal religious advisor. Still, Grace wondered why he was on his fourth marriage. At Mason's suggestion, she decided to call Jack and Owen. Jack, an old high school buddy of Joe's, lived in Manhattan Beach, a stone's throw from Joe's childhood home. You would often see him, a muscular, sandy-haired man, with blue eyes that crinkled when he smiled, skating down the Strand, watching the young babes in their bikinis, or relaxing while downing a brew on his deck with his wife and kids. He had married his high school sweetheart on his 21st birthday. He figured that way he wouldn't forget his anniversary, and was guaranteed a celebratory party every year. His dark blonde hair with its sun-bleached tips was worn too long for the 9-to-5 set, and his lanky build held ripples of muscles under his taut, tanned skin. His broad, calloused hands were those of a hard-working contractor. Jack was a likable guy, one who was always there for you, no matter what. Owen, on the other hand, who also lived in Manhattan Beach, was a guy to watch out for. A career bachelor whose baby face, stylish clothes, and a certain penchant for ladies sometimes caught people off their guard. An Irishman with red stubble for a beard, who cursed like a longshoreman with the least provocation, walked like Larry the Cable Guy, and was as volatile as David Caruso. When he laughed all over, but when he got mad, you'd better get out of his way. Owen's spiked red hair should have been enough to give anybody a warning. His family trust gave him a lifestyle most only dreamed of. The three friends decided to rally around Joe and help him salvage what remained of his marriage. Joe's tragedies had impacted their lives, and the problem seemed to hover over them like an unscripted horror film that they no longer wished to have parts in. They set out from their homes and planned to meet at the Manhattan Beach Pier. "Where is Jack? He said he would meet us here," inquired Mason. "Oh, there he is," Owen replied. "See him? He's over there. He's the man in the very back row in the Dodgers baseball cap, turning slightly away, glancing at the girls in the bikinis playing volleyball." It was no surprise to either of them. Mason's waving hand caught Jack's attention. He elbowed his way through the crowd to join them on the pier. Mason spoke to Jack and Owen in muffled tones. After a quick discussion of Joe's ordeal, the facts were obvious to them. Joe had hidden crimes and was getting what he deserved. Joe hadn't wanted to admit it, but he deserved it. No one was really as good a person as Joe pretended to be. Sure, he worked hard, had great children, and volunteered in the community, but there must have been a hidden wrongdoing somewhere. Joe had always said his family came first, but it seemed like he was always off working. Maybe he even had an affair none of them knew about. It had to be something pretty bad to cause such wrath to come upon him. That much was clear as day. How would they help him? Simple. He must repent. He must beg for forgiveness with all his heart, though whether or not God would grant his request was another matter. After picking up some lunch from Old Venice Restaurant, they headed down Highland Avenue to Joe's house. When they reached the Strand, they saw him from a distance. They could hardly recognize him. He looked so ill. Joe sat on his deck watching the surf. He picked up a bottle, twisted the top off, and gulped down cold, clear spring water. He noticed the approaching footsteps and heard the low murmurs of his friends. They came up the stairs to the deck and nodded at Joe with their eyes level and unreadable. Mason was flawlessly polite, though he was having second thoughts about his friend's integrity. "Joe, good to see you, buddy. How's things?" Joe chuckled wryly. "Hell, things are horrible. 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Sit down, we need to talk. Look what all this has done to me. It's making me dump all my feelings on my friends." Mason gently patted Joe on the back as he continued. "That's why we're here today. We want to openly discuss our feelings regarding what happened, to put an end to everyone's speculations. If you have something you want to say, please feel free to interrupt. We are here for you, buddy. I think it would be good for you to have the first say. We'll just eat lunch while you tell us your story." Jack and Owen grunted, "What's up?" and sat down at the table and doled out lunch. They started off with a pita platter with amazing hummus and tzatziki, toasted pita wedges, and a prosciutto bruschetta with fresh Romano cheese. The main course was lasagna, Greek salad, and garlic bread. If the wives had been there, they would have accompanied the meal with wine, but being the men they were, they preferred a cold beer. Birds soared at the seashore, and overhead, fat white clouds drifted lazily across the pure blue sky. Smells of seaweed and salt danced in the air. The warm sunlight touched their faces, while a cool breeze refreshed them. They sat for the longest time and watched the tide roll in and crash on the shore. Joe couldn't say a word and felt disconnected from them, as if none of it was real, not even the heat of the sun on his cheeks. He looked into their eyes, staring at each of his friends. He suddenly realized how much he truly loved them. He could see disappointment and sympathy on their faces. Beginning slowly, while picking his fingernails for stray remnants of dinner, he struggled to relay the details without bogging it down, without skipping over anything relevant. In silence, they listened. "I never ever thought this would actually happen to me, and I sure didn't think anything would happen to my kids either," Joe remorsefully remarked. Taking a deep breath, he immediately, even desperately, tried to compose himself. Even as he searches for the words to recount what has happened, he could see it all as if it were happening again. He didn't want his friends to see him like this, and he could only imagine what they were thinking. "I need to pull myself together. I don't want them to get the wrong impression. Why am I crying? I need their help, not their sympathy." They watched, saying nothing. "I never thought I'd come to this point. I almost feel sick to say I'm Catholic. No one ever told me I would come to the point where the familiar trappings of Christianity would no longer seem to work for me. You know," he looked up at them, "I have no problem with the Christian doctrine of love. It is wonderful." He shook his head. "The trouble with the church is they say they believe something and then they do things totally different, as if they never actually believe it to begin with. And now I'm having trouble trying to figure out why this happened." Joe sneered just a bit. Everybody's saying anything that comes in their mind and nobody has any answers, denying that they have any part in this whole affair. They don't know why it happened, but they are sure it's not their fault." Joe stopped as an uneasy feeling came over him. He felt relieved that he had gotten it off his chest, but also a little ashamed, as men weren't expected to share their emotions. Joe didn't want to appear weak. The imps and guards in and around Joe's house heard a thunderous sound and paused in their duties of sending harassing thoughts to the men. Smug grinned. "I believe it's foreboding, coming with fresh forces from Satan." The swarm appeared, still a mile away, approaching like a flock of vultures. There were at least 100 flying in a random formation. The red glow of their words appeared against the sinister ghostly shadow of their wings. They hovered over Joe's deck, casting a spiritual shadow upon its entire length. The mood became so ominous that all the men felt it. The dogs in the neighborhood began to bark and howl. A battalion of Satan's hand-picked best descended with their wings, producing a roar that blew the smaller imps into the sky. Forebodin landed on the deck with 13 disgusting demons surrounding him. The remainder of the group took positions around the perimeter of the house. The wings settled down, the roar receded. Forebodin took a moment to size up the situation. His muscular arms rippled, his expansive black wings rising behind him like a royal robe, his jewels luminous and splendid in the sun. He watched with narrow, scorching eyes. "It seems we will soon have reason to celebrate. I've received word that Criticism's visit with Mason was very successful. We have all our players in their places, and a strong network at our disposal." He stopped to think for a moment, his black talons scratching like hooks at the unkempt hair on his head. Forebodin spit sulphur and let his anger blaze. He sniggered a sulphurous snigger. "I can't wait to see my little imps in action. They're all here. Criticism, strife, gossip, jealousy, pride, offense, scabby, and my favorite, self-righteousness. These humans are pathetic. We will make them vindictive, unjust judges over this whole affair. There will be so much strife that not even the simplest prayer will be spoken. As you all know, where there is strife, there is disorder, and every evil thing." Joe's thoughts went around and around as he sat trying to collect them. He watched the clouds move in and hide the sunshine, leaving the sky a gloomy, hazy gray. "I feel a little disillusioned. Well, it's more like I'm confused about who God is. The more I long to know him, the more distant he feels. Where is he? Will I really find him in all the religious trappings of the Catholic Church? I feel like I've been living like I ought to know, but now my security blanket has been ripped from my arms. I used to feel safe, but—" Joe, looking toward the ocean, paused to regroup his thoughts. Tears came to his eyes, and they sat in silence for a while. Feeling Joe's pain made them uncomfortable. Standing, Mason said he needed another beer and headed for the house. The other men followed, hoping to let Joe have a moment to compose himself. In a huddle in the kitchen, they discussed his problems one more time. "Traumatic? Did you see his face? Horrible! What's up with all those scabs? If it were me, I'd be in the psychologist's office every day. He's bound to need some help getting over all this." Returning to the deck, Mason offered Joe a beer. "Let's give this another try," Mason said. Even though Mason was having some trouble in his own marriage and was actually more concerned about it than Joe's problem, he still saw a great opportunity to share his worldly wisdom. Suffering was a great teacher, and a tremendous opportunity was available to point Joe down the right path. What Mason did not realize was that the mystery of the last few months had been asking all of them to look inward, further than was comfortable, and to look outward to a place just beyond the limits of their knowledge. Grumbling in discontent, Joe cursed, "I shouldn't have been born. All my life has brought is sorrow. Everyone would be better off without me. I've contributed nothing to life. The world seems so dark. I hope everyone forgets the day I was born, and it passes forever from history." He paused. "Would have been better if I were aborted. My mother should have killed me, and I would now be buried with my family. I'd be in heaven." Forebodin had waited to hear those words. He sucked in his breath through his fangs and began to spew profanity. It was the highest kind of ecstasy, a demonic exhilaration he felt only rarely, a precious and very ripe reward to be enjoyed only after much labor and preparation. Joe took a deep breath and then sighed out. All the killing, Lord. My children, Lord. Raw evil is everywhere. Nothing would make me happier than if I were now dead. Then I wouldn't have a life full of troubles. My life is so difficult. Why am I made to suffer? Why do I have to go on living? I would gladly remain poor if only I had some peace. My body is throbbing. I can't sleep, eat, or rest with all the troubles I have. Sometimes I even wonder why I remain in such a difficult position, such an uphill effort. But for me, I just need the answer to why all this has happened. Mason nodded thoughtfully. He could tell Joe was quite agitated. Do you have anything to add to that? Mason looked from Owen to Jack and back again at Joe. Joe made no attempt to hide the anguish on his face. I know I will win this battle if I can just find the answer. So much has transpired that I can't imagine what kind of an experience could reveal God to me. If God is love, why didn't he stop this evil from happening? Michael paces back and forth on the neighbor's roof. The question startles him. He glances at Raphael. I wish that Joe knew that everything in the universe, every plant and animal, everything that exists is governed by the law established by God. We can only hope he will start reading his Bible. He will see that the laws of nature are the ordinances of heaven and earth. Man can choose if he wants to obey or follow his own path. Everyone has been warned that the wages of sin are death. What you sow is what you reap. Raphael shakes his head in agreement. Why was Job so surprised when judgment came? It's not that God is mean or has favorites. God's laws are not haphazard or arbitrary. If you step off the roof, gravity will kick in and you will fall. When you fear, you have to face the consequences. Is that God's fault? As Joe finished, Jack patted his arm and said, You did fine. I think we all get the picture. Joe was not sure. They both knew it was a lie, but Jack felt he had to say it. Mason had always seemed like a likable guy, but now Joe was getting an uneasy feeling about him. He looked into Mason's eyes, strong eyes, steely, eyes without pity. To Joe it felt like Mason was trying to find some deep, dark secret in Joe's soul. He wagged his fork at Joe before stabbing the last piece of lasagna on his paper plate. Mason was hard to ignore, and he liked it that way. After a big swig of beer, he belched loudly and leaned back against his chair, studying Joe's face. Joe was puzzled. He stretched out his legs, scratched them, and groaned. What was with Mason's surly attitude? Joe ate a bite of garlic bread, guessing that he would get around to giving his opinion about whatever was on his mind in his own time. It seemed clear that there was a typical number of words on Mason's mind. I've known you most of my life, and I hope you won't be upset when I tell you what I think, but I just feel I have your answer. In the past, you have helped so many of us with advice. Well, now it is our chance to return the favor. Your words have supported us, and now that you're discouraged, we will try to help you. If you are entirely blameless in all that has happened, shouldn't you be slightly more hopeful? God never destroys the innocent. You've said so yourself. It seems to me that those who sow evil reap trouble. In his righteous anger, he has no choice but to destroy evil people. Just last night, a word was brought to me when I was having trouble sleeping. I awoke from a nightmare and was seized with fear. A spirit guided past my face, and the hair on my body stood on end. It stopped, but I couldn't tell what it was. A form stood before me, and I heard its hushed voice. It gave me a message for you. He stopped talking abruptly, as if he might have said something he hadn't meant to say. Actually, if Mason had any genuine wisdom, he would have recognized his midnight visitor was a demon. Criticism sat on the ceiling. A powerful conundrum of backbiting filth, shrieking profanities. Criticism straightforwardly shared his thoughts with Mason. His critical spirit was designed to cause division and trouble with no end. In a matter of minutes, he had convinced Mason to criticize Joe to such a degree that it would disrupt any type of harmony that remained in his life. His power came fresh from the pit of hell, and Mason ignorantly followed his dirty, foul suggestions. Joe considered what Mason had just said, his forehead creased in concentration. He tried to make sense of it. Everyone was silent, and it felt a little awkward. Joe's intuition told him Mason did not want to hear what he was thinking. He could feel his eyes on his face, waiting for Joe to give some kind of sign about what he thought. He finally said. Your experience is thought-provoking. A strange gleam came into Joe's eyes, as though something had just occurred to him. Mason saw a dim glimmer of possibility in Joe's smile, and proceeded as if he were talking for God himself. Can a man be more blameless than God? Can even a strong man be more pure than his Maker? If God charges his angels with misconduct, how much more will he accuse those who live here on earth? You can consult your priest, but will he have a better answer? Your resentment is already killing you. You are just skin and bones. It is like your family has been cursed. Your hardships do not spring from the ground, yet it appears your family is doomed to tragedy. Mason smiled as if he could read Joe's thoughts. Perhaps he thought he saw an obvious sign on his face that indicated he was on the right track. The only answer I have for you is to plead for mercy. You have seen in the past that God performs miracles. Just yesterday he sent the rain to water the earth. Mason would not hesitate to point out to Joe his many flaws and imperfections. As much as anyone was willing to impose his views on Joe, he had once told him that he would love to kill anyone who tried to impose their values on him. In truth, he loved giving people a hard time. I've seen many people face tragedies in their lives. It seems that those who mourn and are remorseful eventually find peace. However, criminals are caught and punished for their craftiness. They will pay for the suffering they have caused others. Look what happened to Bernie Madoff. God saves the poor from scoundrels and powerful men who are unjust. What is it you've done? Suddenly, Mason leaned forward with a strange smile on his face, his hands folded tightly and his gray eyes giving Joe a numbing, penetrating, strangely ominous gaze. That didn't sound right to Joe. How about trying another angle? I don't think you're going down the right track. I haven't done anything. Mason stopped, considered, and then continued as if he was trying to sell Joe something. He could see that he wasn't getting through to Joe, who was looking around impatiently and scratching his sores. Just one more thing, he soberly stated, trying to hold Joe's attention. You should feel blessed that God cares enough about you to correct the wrong you have committed. Do not become high-minded and scorn his discipline. I know you feel wounded, but he will restore you if you just repent. Joe flinched back from Mason's highly criticizing remarks. His mouth hung open, and he quickly shut it. He was visibly upset. Joe deflated a little. The conversation was turning sour. Joe just couldn't accept what Mason said. It was just so difficult to hear the things he knew weren't true. Joe stared at Mason, attempting to mask his emotions. He didn't like having this conversation under the present conditions, yet he knew, to find the answers he was searching for, a smart person would look at all sides before he came to any conclusion. But what he just heard in the conversation wasn't relative to what had happened to him and Grace. Mason figured he'd better retreat while he could. He leaned forward and began to speak in a low voice filled with intense passion. Once things are back to normal, you can stop fearing and your life will return to what it once was. I've thought about this a lot. Please take my advice. I'm only telling you this because I care so much for you and Grace." Joe's throat suddenly felt dry and tight, and his stomach startlingly queasy. He got up and sat in a lounge chair next to a table. He took a sip of water before he could answer. "Can't you see how depressed I am? Do you know of anyone who has been through what I have and not gone insane? The trouble God has sent to my family is a poison. I miss my children. I miss them so much." Joe combed his hair with his fingers, a nervous gesture, and then asked, "I've one desire, and that is that God would tell me why. How can I have any hope when I am suffering? Please, God, take me out of my misery. How can I help myself when all my success is gone? I'm feeling lousy, and I don't know what to do. I feel empty, useless, and worthless." Joe said his last statement with a rather growling tone. "You don't seem to understand this at all. I'm sure you wish I would just cheer up and get over things. You think I can just snap out of this, but it's not that simple. I wish it was. I'm feeling lousy, and I really don't know what to do. Rather than acting like a friend, you turn into an accusing shoulder. I thought we were bros. You are useless. I don't want you to BS me, and so far I haven't gotten any answers." He spoke quickly before the pain developed into something too great to bear. It was obvious that Joe had been so consumed by his anger, he'd become uncertain about what to say next. He became conscious of the thundering pounding of his heart. His breathing was quick, his muscles were tense, his heart racing, and adrenaline was coursing through his bloodstream. His fight-or-flight response was fully activated. A big spirit who was standing next to Owen shrieked out an order, and 7 imps converged on him like starving predators, the words flashing and the tongues wagging. Laughing, taunting, and teasing, they stayed there to make complete confusion. The imps were in a blind rage. His denial only seemed to fuel Owen's offensiveness. "It's not like that. You just don't understand. Mason is trying to understand and help you." Owen defended his friend, suddenly vehemently. "What's gotten into you, Joe?" Suddenly, Joe clammed up, but his face showed he had more to tell. Uneasy, he continued his discourse. "Did I ask you to bail me out? No! You've known me for years. Have you ever seen me do evil things? I'm in deep trouble. I thought I could count on you for help. If you guys could just show me what I've done that is so wrong that I deserve this, I will shut up. Truthfully, do you think I deserve this? Why are good people punished and the bad people get off scot-free?" He paused for effect. "Have I ever lied to you? Maybe you would like to reconsider your advice." Joe didn't say another word, but his face showed resounding anger. Sighing in pain, he tried to think things over. "I don't like Owen's tone of voice. What's up with him? It's like he has a bee up his butt. What impulsive, imprudent, or over-assuming mistakes have I made? Why isn't Mason extending me a little grace, just this once? It's not like any of them are angels. All of them have done worse things than me, and nothing this evil has happened to them. Where is the justice in this?" In the past, Joe had understood that bad things happened to corrupt people. Over the years, he had watched as his friends and family dealt with unfortunate circumstances when their choices were to blame. His brother had gotten his girlfriend pregnant at homecoming. Big mistake. Then, to compound the sin, he had paid for the abortion. William had thought it would be no big deal. When he went to bed that night, he realized that he had paid to have his own child terminated. He was confused when his girlfriend was okay with having an abortion, but he found himself depressed, feeling guilty, grieving, and shame-filled. He felt isolated and weird, and his only relief coming from drinking and drugs. After several years of counseling, he was better, but it was as though a little demon sat on his back reminding him of his past. At his son's first birthday, he realized that the child he aborted would have been 8. One more shadow passed by. It was a reminder: don't make decisions that you know are wrong. His sister Mary was another story. She was an angel. Everyone said so. Everyone loved Mary, including that deadbeat she met in college. He was a smart talker, the true woman's man. His bad boy attitude was like a magnet. Although the priest who gave them counseling before the marriage warned Mary to reconsider, she gave no credence to his wisdom. "I love him, and you always taught us we should love everyone. I know I can help him be a different man. If not, I will take it as my cross to bear and live with it the rest of my life." Well, Paul didn't feel the same way. After 3 children and 6 years of marriage, he left her for a 22-year-old and moved to New York. Joe's sister was an angel, but a very naive one, to say the least. Checkpoint number 2. Don't make foolish decisions because you haven't done your homework on that topic. Trying to find some new revelation of truth was lonely at times. Joe just felt so tired of everything. Maybe Mason thought his words were prophecy, but to Joe it was a lot of hogwash. How would he know if God really spoke to Mason? He hadn't heard anything. Everyone seemed to have a cure for what ailed him. You know that what you sow is what you reap. You need to repent of your evil deeds and come back to God. Read your Bible and pray more effectively. Is that all the wisdom you've got? "My God, Joe," Mason finally replied, "how long will you continue to whine? Can you truly say that God has perverted his judgment about you? Come on, Joe. You must realize that when your children were out partying, they must have done a few bad things. Don't you think they might have deserved it?" He waved one hand in the air as if he were giving a sermon. Joe was a little stunned to hear the words coming from Mason. Joe listened attentively to Mason's homily, recognizing there was something strange in the tone of his voice. The guy was being slanderous, he thought, but selling it all very well. Joe figured he was due for a large heavenly reward for his patience. He couldn't imagine anyone else would have listened to such bullshit. "I just wish these attacks would stop. I've tried to logically understand, but I can't. It's just so miserably unpleasant, and I want it all to go away. It's as interesting as the way a gallbladder or heart attack are interesting. A pain you want to end. Why do feelings of doom and terror have to keep bubbling up? Why don't they just pick up stones and throw them at me? I don't think that would hurt as much." Mason was still waiting for his answer, giving Joe that numbing gaze. "But if you will actually tell God how sorry you are for all the things you did wrong, I'm sure he will forgive you and set things right. Things might seem bad now, but your future will be brighter. You're smart, and I'm sure you can make millions again. Ask your dad. I'm sure he can point out where you went wrong. You know that bad things happen to people who forget God." Joe was ready to talk, but not be stared at. Joe ground his teeth in an effort to control his frustration. Despite everything he had promised himself, Joe saw red. He jumped up and dragged Mason out of his chair, grabbing him by the front of his shirt. Mason held up both hands and smiled. "Hey, don't get so riled up. I'm only trying to help. What's wrong with you, Joe?" The air was filled with deafening cries of the hideous spirits. Demon after demon tried to outdo one another. The demons were foaming and frothing, wailing and hissing. The intensity of their onslaught was shocking, surprisingly strong. They were bold, brash, and reckless, attacking with screams and shrieks, even grinning mockingly. Without angelic intervention, they were invincible. And while the order for angelic forces to stand down was in effect, the demonic warlord tried out some new tactics. Giving up on his current method of preaching, he uncrossed his arms and leaned forward, examining Joe intently. He opened his mouth to speak, closed it again, and rubbed his hand over his jaw. Joe watched him with faint bewilderment. He acted as if he were perturbed by something, yet Joe saw nothing unusual. "Surely God has not found you blameless. He only does this to evil people. If you just get up and turn yourself around, he will once again bring laughter into your home. He'll clear your path for victory, and your business rivals will be put to shame." With that, Mason could tell he overstepped his boundaries. Joe looked irritated and amazed at the same time. Joe forced a toothy smile. "But how will I ever prove to God my innocence? His wisdom is profound, and his power is beyond anything I can comprehend. Who has ever challenged God and won? God speaks and the sun stops in the sky. He alone created the heavens and causes the tides to turn. He set our universe on the hinge of Pleiades. He performs wonders and miracles I do not understand. The problem is that we never see him. Why is he so mad at me?" Joe began his comeback carefully, trying very hard to sound like a sensible individual as he related his major points. He struggled with his words. He was trying to avoid making Mason become defensive. "When he let my children be taken, I could not stop him. I can't seem to find the words to argue with him. Though I haven't done anything wrong, I fear he will crush me with a storm and multiply my suffering for no reason. He is most surely stronger than me, and who am I to challenge his justice? It appears to me that he destroys both the innocent and the guilty. Look at all the scandals in the newspaper. Although America has fallen into the hands of criminals, he seems to have blinded the judges to condemn them. A murderer is sentenced to 2 years in prison, while a drug user is sentenced to 15 years. Where is the justice? If it's not the sovereign Lord, then who is it?" Joe was impressed by how easily Mason was becoming flustered, but he tried not to press his challenge any further. Not yet, anyway. Instead, he picked up where he left off and brought it to a finish. "Even if I could muster up the courage to put a smile on my face, I would still dread the suffering. Since I've already been found guilty and punished, I can't understand why I still want to fight on and prove my innocence. Tall as I am, I look like a matchstick. My hair is very dry, my skin is oozing, and my eyes, which were once piercing, are now listless and dull. I constantly feel fatigued, and my unbearable tiredness does not go away even when I rest. If only there was someone who could talk to God and get him to show me a little mercy. Then I would be able to talk to him without fear. But as it stands with me, I cannot." Joe was disturbed when he thought that Mason was going to try to top what he'd already said. Jack saw that Mason was getting nowhere. He flinched and finally took a deep breath, asking, "Have you ever thought that these murderers could ever be God's appointed messengers?" Jack's message caused Joe to shake his head in disagreement a number of times, and he grumbled some evasive reply. Joe, in his wildest dreams, would never believe that they were chosen ones, that God appointed anyone, or that God gave assignments to brutally murder good people. No. How could these men have ever been selected to carry out the work of God? His deep discomfort showed on his face as he continued to think. How could Joe explain how he felt without sounding self-pitying? He was once again frustrated and close to tears. He hadn't come to hear a sermon. He wanted answers. Instead of one unlucky event, this would mean that God was predetermining the killer's every move and the death of my children. It made him even more furious when Jack suggested that maybe it was an accident, being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He wanted to scream out loud as he grasped the absurdity of it all. Was he crazy? This was no accident. It was premeditated murder. His heart, which had gone sluggish with discouragement, sped up, and Joe could feel his pulse hammering in his neck. There were no accidents. There was a reason for the home invasion, just as there was a reason for Joe being who he was. What made Jack's comments infinitely more ludicrous to Joe was that he was so full of doubt. He expressed doubt in the most eloquent and sympathetic ways. In his completely logical and convincing view, the Bible was a book with a troubling plot, but a plot that could be understood. God created us out of love, but we don't want God, or we don't believe in Him, or we pay very poor attention to Him. Nevertheless, God continues to love us. At least He continues to try to get our attention. And the real trick was having faith, he said, even if things weren't remotely going the way we thought they should. Intellectuality said, you must do something. You just need to work and strive and seek. Maybe a little meditation and yoga would help. Jack knew all the best stories in the Bible and assured them that doubt was the essence of faith and not faith's opposite. He hemmed and hawed, but Jack didn't manage to say anything coherent or helpful. Well, maybe God has some purpose in this. If God wants you well, why doesn't He heal you? Joe was bewildered. He stood up and paced around, waiting and wondering what to say next. It was like some kind of disease. Everyone was infected, and no one could recognize the injustice. Why are my friends indicting me? I know they hear what I've been saying. Friends are supposed to listen to what you say, but best friends even listen to what you don't say. It would be better if they sat silently rather than say things that make no sense. Have they lost their minds? I used to think they were intelligent guys. I thought I could count on them. My life feels so empty. I'm being swallowed whole by vicious sharks, ripping, shredding, leaving me in pieces. Joe slapped the side of his head, pretending there was something wrong with his hearing. Did I hear you right? You're unbelievable. But this is one thing I do know. God wants everyone saved and not everyone is. He growled. Somehow I must have a part to play in this. I know I've seen God initiate healings on His own sometimes, but I don't think that is the way He usually does it. If I just sit around waiting for a miracle, I might just die. I just have to find the answer to why all of this happened. Joe recoiled and bit his lip. Jack could see that his words had bothered him, but he couldn't figure out why. After all, Joe had invited them there to give their opinion. Owen leaned toward Joe so that their faces were only an inch apart. There's no reason for you to be so upset with Jack. He is only trying to help you find answers. Owen rolled his eyes, signaling that he was not amused with Joe's attitude. Joe started to say something angry from his expression, but he stopped himself and took a breath. His face looked as if it were carved in stone. He contemplated not responding to Owen, but instead blurted out, "You don't seem to get it. I didn't choose this. I don't know why it happened." His voice turned bitter. "I lay in bed longing for sleep so that these months of misery will be hidden with sweet dreams. Yet the night drags on and I toss and turn until the sun rises. My body is racked with pain and my breaths are labored. I can't imagine that I will ever be happy again." He let his thoughts trail off, and they restarted in a swell of quiet sadness. As a sun vanishes across the sky and is never seen again, so I hope to die and never return. I despise my life. Why are you testing me, God? Even at night you give me terrifying dreams so that now I desire death more than life? Please, God, in your sovereignty, have mercy on me. I've suffered more than one can endure. Shouldn't you pardon my sins and forgive me?" Joe laughed once in disbelief. They all heard the edge in his voice. "My wholesale business is so harassed and so sabotaged by an unseen monster, I guess you would call it that. I can't fill my orders, clients are seeking other suppliers, and I just can't seem to stay above water anymore. The business is stretched to the breaking point. Why do they say you can't keep a good man down?" Joe's furious glower made it hard to answer. "You know, Joe, you're awfully self-righteous, considering all that has happened to your family," snapped Owen. Joe waited a moment before he answered, knowing Owen was experiencing the same frustration. The tension was making them both lightheaded. A dozen emotions were sailing around before he settled on being pissed off. Joe actually grabbed Owen's shirt in his fist. His eyes were wild, and he hissed the words silently through his lips. Idiots! He hated to say this about his friends, but all of them were morons. Stop right there! Not another word! Owen said nothing, but he didn't back down either. Joe didn't like that at all. His eyes flashed back to Owen, and they exchanged a loaded gaze. He pursed his lips for a second, deciding what to say, and then he glanced abruptly at Owen as if he might grab him again. You don't understand. You just don't seem to be able to hear what I've been saying, Joe repeated, scowling at Owen. You could be a bit more understanding. You have no idea how truly difficult this ordeal has been. Owen stared at him disbelievingly. He looked into his face, at his defensive eyes. He noticed how his eyes had deep dark circles, that he was extremely uptight. He frowned at what he saw. It was a while before Joe noticed. Everything was dead silent for an endless minute. Joe tried to be strong, but he didn't think he could hold back the tears. Hysteria was edging in on him. He could feel it, pushing him closer to the brink. Shaking almost uncontrollably, he steadied himself by grabbing Mason's shoulder. You'll get through this, Owen promised. He sounded convincing and persuasive, and Joe clung to the promise of his words. It's going to be all right, understand? Joe nodded, desperately wanting to believe him. To ease the tension that was so apparent, a serene voice with a heavy southern accent asked, Are y'all going to eat the rest of the garlic bread? Matt had his eyes locked on the remains of the huge meal the men had consumed. No, Joe sighed with sadness. I seem to have lost my appetite. Go ahead, have whatever you want. Matt reached over, grabbed a piece of garlic bread, and shoved it in his mouth. Owen smiled a smile of pity. He put his hand on Joe's shoulder and spoke condescendingly. Joe, come on. If you really think we're hopeless and unhelpful, maybe you should ask your gardener for help. So Mason, Jack, and Owen stopped answering Joe because he told them he was not to blame for what had happened. Matt Scott, Joe's gardener, had been eavesdropping on the conversation while eyeing the remains of lunch no one seemed to want. He thought Joe was acting a little self-righteous. Why was he defending himself and blaming everything on God? If something or someone was to blame, surely it wasn't God. Matt had his own theory, but so far had said nothing. Matt Scott had been Christopher's best friend. He was a young, attractive man in his late 20s, with unkempt brown hair and large, tiger-like eyes. Matt was just about to complete his MBA from UCLA. He felt a bit intimidated talking in front of Owen. Something seemed to draw their attention to Matt, a small, mischievous, troublemaker imp, Funk. He was lackluster black with bright ruby eyes. He had pointed ears, slanted thin eyes, thin, elegant hands, and the most malicious grin with slightly yellow, very sharp teeth. He prompted Mason to ask Matt for his opinion. Funkiness embraced the group. Matt's moodiness was aroused. Why hadn't anyone found a plausible way to refute Joe? They seemed so sanctimonious. Taking several deep breaths to calm himself, he began. I'm young and thought you would be wiser than I, but you are speaking foolishly. I had to bite my tongue when I heard your absurd reasoning. None of you has proved Joe wrong. Why do you refuse to answer his questions? He was right. Every man at the table hated to admit it, but Matt was right. There was a long, fidgety silence. They all looked at the skaters passing, and only occasionally at each other. This longest of days seemed to stretch on and on and on. Joe wondered if it would ever end. A smile flickered across Matt's tense face. He decided to break the silence. His voice was soft and accented by a slow southern drawl that allowed him to pause to make his speech more effective. I will now have my say, and I'll admit that I feel like a volcano ready to erupt. I will tell the truth without trying to flatter any of you. Joe, please listen carefully. You have said, I'm squeaky clean. I've done no wrong. I've not sinned. Why has God chosen me to be his enemy? Why has he allowed this to happen?" As he talked, his eyes scrutinized Joe. Matt responded to the question, saying, "Aren't you misrepresenting God and discrediting His love and character? God is mighty, yet just and quick to warn and forgive. Joe, you have always been a kind and honorable man, but you aren't perfect. Perhaps your biggest mistake is that you have said God does not speak. I say He does. He tells us where and when to go and keeps us from falling into harm's way. Do you have anything to say to this?" Matt ended his statement and brought it to an orderly finish. But Joe wasn't sure he liked what Matt said either. He wasn't even sure he heard it all. He suddenly felt very weak and angry. And what about his suspicion? He knew he didn't buy anything this guy said. Or did he? Had he just misunderstood him? Joe couldn't think straight or feel straight. He just felt so tired. "Sorry, guys, but I just don't buy anything you've said." Matt pointed his finger at Joe, looking down that finger with cold brown eyes. "Now right there is a problem in itself. You've lost your objectivity in this whole thing, totally and completely. If we had given you the answer, even half an answer, I don't think you'd admit it." Matt's face went blank and suddenly red. His hands started to shake. "You have your own ideas, and that is all you are willing to believe. We don't know what kind of person you are when we aren't around. None of us does. And if you are unwilling to listen to reason, I don't think any of us will be able to trust you anymore." The nausea began coming in mild waves, crashing over Joe before receding. He felt like he might vomit, but instead he let a loud belch escape through his lips. His sense of time got blurry. He began to perspire profusely, and when the nausea passed, he was dripping in sweat. Joe felt faint, and he worried that he might pass out, aspirate, and die. When he mentioned it to them, they responded that he looked a little pale. This increased his anxiety because if they were worried, then he should be really scared. On the other hand, at that moment, at some level, Joe wanted to pass out, even if that meant dying. Joe took a quick moment to be quiet and break the momentum of this building confrontation. He spoke softly. "Guys, you need to give me a little slack here. Listen, we mean no offense. Please understand. I mean, we all appreciate your position. You must realize God's ways are mysterious." Mason pushed his chair back and stood to stretch his legs. "Joe, I'm sure you realize that we have some strong and some weak arguments on our side, and maybe even a few of our points are arguable. But please do not be so headstrong. You aren't perfect. In fact, sometimes you are very wrong in your opinions." Mason hit him one last time. Joe challenged Mason. "Can't you at least pray that I will be healed of this debilitating disease?" Mason took a moment, then replied, "You are much too excited, Joe. It's best to say God's will be done." Joe became angry. He had heard enough. He glared out at the horizon, fuming. In frustration, he stood and told his friends, "Well, don't worry about me. I'll make it through. I know I will see things more clearly when I find the answers on the other side. This is my journey, and my faith will get me through. I'm sure I'll find the path to God." He turned and walked toward the house. "I'm a little tired, so I think I will have to go inside for a nap. Thanks for coming, and I will consider all you said." For Bowden basked silently in the moment, letting his thoughts run free. Success was just around the corner. He pointed his crooked finger at no demon in particular, and then at one overly anxious fighter. "Do your worst tonight while Joe mulls over the day. Joe isn't angered by mere misfortune, but by misfortune conceived as injury. And thankfully, Joe's sense of injury is based on his legitimate claim that he has done no wrong and has been denied his answer. We must therefore zealously guard his mind from finding the true answer. He must never be permitted to doubt that his deductions were wrong. Our next attack has a better chance of success because Joe's whole world is cold and empty and miserable." Joe examined their faces for just a moment and then went inside his house, letting the door slam. Joe was fuming. He hesitated. Then he snapped. His voice grew hushed and grave. "What a bunch of dumb shits. What business do they have snooping in my daily affairs? It's not like their lives are perfect. Joe observed that medication, Xanax, Klonopin, Celexa, and alcohol were more effective at soothing him than his friends could ever be. Now his legs were weak and numb, and his breath so labored. As he stood taking a pee, he noticed it was a light shade of pink. Things weren't shaping up like he had hoped. Feeling hopeless and trapped, he wondered if he should be driving himself to the emergency room. Joe sat on the couch, his head on his arms, sobbing his heart out to God. "Oh, God, surely I don't have to die. Why did you make me sick? Are you the author of the sufferings that are in this world? What is happening to the world? Where did all this malice and cruelty come from? I guess I've lost everyone. If only one true friend would walk in, I would gladly let the others go. My questions demand an answer. But none of them really gave me an answer. They just gave me some theological concepts that do not amount to anything." Joe made a disgusted face, only because he knew no one was there to see it. He was clearly unhappy. So the consensus was that Joe was just supposed to forget about the deranged killings, his almost bankrupt business, his crumbling marriage, his excruciating sickness, and let God's will be done. His calm had completely worn off. That is, if it had ever been there. He certainly did not want their pity. There were so many things he wanted to know. Were his friends all nuts? Joe knew it wasn't even worth a minute of his time to consider their suggestions. Joe wanted to make sure his friends were gone, so he leaned over to peek out through the slider door. The coast was clear. His emotions had covered a full range in a single afternoon. He was energized when he saw his friends arrive with lunch. There was no other word for it. After lunch, he felt like a kid caught with his hand in the cookie jar. Guilty, depressed, accused of wrongdoing. Now, just minutes after they left, he was thrown into despair, convinced beyond a doubt that he'd never have the answer to his question. Why? He sat down in his bed and thought for a moment. Exhausted from the ordeal, he put his head on the pillow just to rest, and before he knew it, he was loudly snoring.